Okay, hi everybody. This is the second language acquisition portion of Module 3. The first video was around a half hour, so I'm going to try to make this one a little bit quicker. And so I will share my screen with you. And so we're starting with second language acquisition. You remember the first three theories that we talked about from monolingual language development? Well, we might be able to guess who this is, judging by the little figure down below, because we've looked at that figure before. Yes, this is Jim Cummins, who back in, was it 1978 or something like that, sort of after Chomsky's theories have been sort of circulating for a while, he comes up with linguistic interdependence, and he sort of builds a little bit on Chomsky and thinking about surface features of language. L1 being first language, L2 being second language, and he articulated this notion of a common underlying proficiency, which we discussed in the foundations class. That is, that there are dimensions of language that transfer from the L1 to the L2, particularly as proficiency in the L2 gets higher. Those proficiencies already developed in the L1 have some opportunities to pass to the L2 via the common underlying proficiency. So I'll give you some examples of that in just a moment. But linguistic interdependence is essentially a second language acquisition theory. It's a bilingual focused theory of second language acquisition. So another way to think about bilingualism in second language learners is along two continua, elective circumstantial and simultaneous sequential. And that has to do with your language acquisition, your second language acquisition. So kids can be, and again, this is too simple, but it's a good entree to thinking about some of this stuff. Kids can be an elective bilingual, that is, you choose to become bilingual, or they can be a circumstantial bilingual, that is, you didn't choose to be bilingual, you just are by virtue of your circumstances. This can be if you are raised bilingually, which we'll talk about more in subsequent modules, or if you emigrate to a different country where they don't speak your native language with your parents or with a parent or a caregiver or whoever you emigrate with, children likely do not choose to emigrate, except in perhaps the case of refugees, which is more and more common these days in the United States. But for the most part, kids are with an adult, a caregiver who immigrates and makes that decision for them, thus making a circumstantial issue. And then there's issues of simultaneity and sequentiality. So simultaneous bilinguals grow up speaking two languages, whereas sequential bilinguals learn their first language and then learn their second language at some point later in the future. So that would be me up here in the upper right corner. I am an elective sequential bilingual. I started to learn Spanish in 7th grade, but I had already learned a whole bunch of English. Oftentimes, however, children of immigration fall under this circumstantial end of the continuum and span simultaneous and sequential bilingualism. So it's just a way to think about it. Oftentimes people tell me that this is too simplistic, and I agree, but again, it's the simplistic way that gets us maybe thinking in more complex ways. So second language acquisition without a bilingual focus came in the 70s and 80s from a theorist / researcher named Stephen Krashen, who many of you may have already heard of. He had many hypotheses of second language acquisition, which put together sort of form some kind of coherent, maybe vision of what second language acquisition is and entails. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. These are the 5: acquisition learning, monitor, natural order, input, and affective filter. They are all very related to each other. The acquisition learning, Krashen states that there are sort of two systems: the acquiring a language and learning a language. Acquiring requires natural interaction, sort of like first language development, like we were watching before, the interactionist hypothesis. You've got to have meaningful interactions with people in order to develop your second language. However, at the same time, unlike first language development, the learning system means you have to actually learn about language. So many of you, myself included, might think back to when you were learning a foreign language in high school, and it wasn't until then that you started to make some grammatical insights and learn grammatical terms or tenses and conjugations. You didn't learn that in your native language. You only learned about those things when you started learning a second language. That's the learning system, where you learn about language. So language use and learning about language is acquisition learning. Monitor means that as you're doing that, particularly in the learning perspective, you're monitoring yourself. This can be with output. So if you're speaking in a second language and you're trying to say something, you're sort of monitoring it as it's coming out. You don't want to say it wrong necessarily. So you're trying to plan, edit, correct. This is difficult when you're in a sort of naturalistic setting having a conversation. So having sufficient time focused on language knowledge is important for that monitor to function appropriately. And Krashen also claims, and this relates to a later one of his hypotheses, that personality types, motivation, engagement, that can all affect how the monitor gets over or underutilized. Natural order, Krashen can claim that there is a specific order to how these grammatical forms are acquired for all learners. That's contested. People don't all think that there's just one way that second language learners acquire all of their language skills and aptitudes. Much like it's contested if there's sort of developmental stages in first language development, this idea that things proceed in stages that are predictable and orderly is convenient, but it's not always necessarily the case. So it's also very difficult to prove because there is so much variation, which actually disproves the idea that there's natural order. The input hypothesis, go back to that first video we watched on the interactionist perspective, and that is what you're seeing is something like the input hypothesis, which is related to the interactionist perspective, and that is that learners continue along natural order when instruction is one step beyond their current stage of their proficiency. So some of you also may have heard of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. This is that. But Krashen called it I+1. So I is sort of your current level of proficiency in a given second language. The +1 is where instruction ought to be, sort of just outside your proficiency grasp so that you can move toward it. Like that father talking to his son, they are in I+1 because he's pulling the son along. And so that's an example of the interactionist hypothesis in first language acquisition. Sort of its parallel is this I+1 in second language acquisition and thinking about teaching and learning. You want your instruction to be somewhere where it's not so far beyond the proficiency of the student that they simply check out because they understand nothing, but you want them to be able to understand something that they can latch on new learning to. Affective filter relates to this motivation and engagement. So motivation, self-confidence, anxiety, they all play filtering roles in second language acquisition. This is super important, right? Because if you're not motivated, if you're not self-confident, and if you're highly anxious, you have a higher filter. That is, you're less able to process information, you're less able to produce language, because all of those things at lower levels, well, lower motivation, lower confidence, higher anxiety, make it difficult to function in the most efficient way from a language learning perspective. However, this is not causal. There are plenty of super anxious people that are very good second language learners, right? So Krashen's argument here is that these things don't cause second language learning, but they do often interact with second language learning. So those are Krashen's sort of a crash course in Krashen. And now I want to return to Cummins' second language acquisition theory, linguistic independence, with just a couple little exercises. So Krashen didn't speak at all about proficiency in the first language. That's what Cummins' contribution was to this. And so this, again, this figure should be familiar to us by now. This is supposed to look like two icebergs out on an ocean. And if you're on a boat looking out, what you see are two separate icebergs. But underneath, what's the reality is it's a single iceberg. It's just got two peaks. Those two peaks are those surface features that Chomsky talked about and also that Jim Cummins is talking about that mask sort of a broader linguistic skill set that kids and other language and adult language learners have and bring to bear on the second language learning process. So, for example, you can have, what that's called in the literature is called cross-linguistic associations. associations between two languages that cross languages. And so one way to, two ways to think about this is cross-language associations at the alphabetic level, that is at the phonemic level, and at the lexical level, the vocabulary level. So for example, the word zapatos, if you don't speak Spanish, I can teach you to read this word, right? You probably, without any instruction, could probably, you might say zapatos, and I would say, well, the Z sounds like an S, so you'd say, zapatos. And then you're pronouncing it, and a native Spanish speaker would understand that you're saying the word for shoes, right? But you wouldn't know that you were saying shoes because you don't speak Spanish. And zapatos and shoes, lexically speaking, are unrelated to each other. So there is alphabetic overlap that you can read the word, but there's not lexical transfer. There are not lexical cross-linguistic associations. Lexically and phonemically, I could also teach you to read the word rapido. And so some people, when they see this who don't speak Spanish or read Spanish, they say rapido. And I'm like, no, the accent's over the A, you stress that vowel. And they're like, oh, I see, rapido. And then, yes, I just taught you to read the word rapido. So that's cross-linguistic association at the phonemic level. Also, there's cross-linguistic association at the lexical level because rapido is a cognate with rapid. And so if I said to you and you spoke no Spanish, what do you think rapido means? Well, you might say, oh, rapid. You might even say fast. And that's where you're seeing cross-linguistic associations at both the alphabetic and the lexical level. And so that can facilitate second language learning when there is orthographic and lexical overlap. Again, getting back to orthography, with your group, try to translate these. Can you translate this? That's Arabic, which that is an alphabetic language, but it is not a Roman script. Right, so it is like English in that it uses an alphabet that has letters, but not the letters we know in English. Chinese, can you translate this? No, these aren't even letters. These are characters. They're logographs. So they represent morphemes, not phonemes. The Arabic represents phonemes. The Chinese represents morphemes. So in this case, there's no lexical overlap, nor is there alphabetic overlap, or any kind of overlap whatsoever. However, I could ask you to translate this. So here I can teach you to read it phonemically. Syntactically, it's the same, right? My mother is intelligent. Mi, my, mama, mother. Es is inteligente, intelligent. There's syntactic overlap. That is subject, verb, adjective, right? So there's lots of overlap here. Similarly, German, as an example to think about syntax. What do you think this means? Same thing as before, right? You can figure this out. Syntactic, alphabetic, and lexical cross-language association. Meine Mutter ist intelligent. My mother is intelligent. Now, I could teach you to, I don't speak German. Take a minute, pause this video, and try to figure out with your colleagues what this means. Translate it. Do your best. Pause me right now and take 5 minutes and try to translate this. Okay, I'm assuming you paused me. You brought me back. Here's the translation. If my mother were not intelligent, I would be sad. So this is a much more complex syntax. So here you have some lexical overlap, alphabetic overlap, but syntactic overlap is not there between the two languages. There is some syntactic overlap, but you have to work really hard to figure it out, whereas with the first one, you don't. It's right there, it's clear, and it's obvious. So that's different ways that Commons' common underlying proficiency functions. It functions to an extent, but it's not a perfect transfer. Not everything transfers, but some things do, particularly when the conditions are right between languages and when your levels of first language literacy are relatively high. There's more to transfer over. So all of that sort of suggests kind of a complex picture of second language acquisition, but what we typically see in schools And at districts and in federal policymaking levels, is it what I call a sort of a tranquil view of second language acquisition? You know, the WIDA, what WIDA level are you? Well, you're 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 6, bridging, right? 1, they all have different names, but pre-production, sometimes referred to as the silent period, where kids aren't talking at all, they're just taking it in. Early production, they're labeling, asking basic questions. Speech emergence, they're commenting, asking other questions. Intermediate fluency to advanced fluency. This is often sometimes called the policymaker's monolingual norm. That is, we have this sort of vision that second language learners will somehow start speaking and behaving and performing just like monolingual English speakers, which is an unrealistic expectation because second language learners aren't monolingual, they're bilingual. So why would we have monolingual expectations for second language learners? This has huge assessment implications, which we'll talk about in more depth in a future module. That's what we typically get is a tranquil view of second language acquisition. But in the Grosjean chapter that you read for today, and what you get from Cummins and Krashen, is that it's really chaos theory in second language acquisition. There's multiple variables that affect it. You know, I have on the left here a set of my own that I came up with: immigration status, age of arrival, proficiency in the first language, socioeconomic status, quality of the instruction that they're receiving in the second language. Every student's different, so L2 acquisition is going to be different for every student. Similarly, Grosjean has a similar figure, which is here on your right. You know, the need, why do you need language X, your second language? What do you use it for? And then given that need, these are some variables here on the left of the level of development that can affect that development, right? So if you just need language X to communicate with family, it's a different set of expectations than if you need it to succeed in school, right? And so then all of these factors, amount of input, type, role of the school, the attitudes toward it, all of those play a role. And so this idea that it would just proceed like this is completely at odds with this. And so, you know, as teachers, we have to keep this in mind, that we use these frameworks to sort of broadly, sort of summatively assess our students, but this is what's really going on in our classrooms and in our students' lives, right? So there's a mismatch here between this tranquil, this chaos. And it's important to keep in mind, because this is more of the reality. This is more of the tranquility. And so that's the end. So the discussion prompt, and you can link to the discussion post section in the Canvas module site. But in your group, discuss these 3 prompts in the context of the reading, these 2, the video on language and thought, and these 2 lectures. Someone should be a note taker, although you can do whatever you want because it's your group and I'm not monitoring you. But as a group, write a summary of your reflections on these questions. There's no word limit. So write as much or as little as you want, but try to tackle each of these questions. You can answer one question at a time, or write a single entry that attempts to sort of thread a response to all 3 of these in one. That is up to you. But thank you for listening. And I look forward to reading your stuff and moving forward with this class.